Hey friends, it's Monday night again, 7 o'clock. For those of you who are not into Monday Night Football, I'm going to do a live reading tonight from Barnaby Conrad's book Matador, which is one of those strange books that you would think would endure since it was considered kind of a literary classic when it first came out. But when I was exposed to it for the first time, probably 25 years ago, I'd never heard of it, never heard of Barnaby Conrad. This book sold 3 million copies when it came out, and John Steinbeck considered it like the best novel of the year when it came out, and was extremely complimentary of Barnaby Conrad's work. And I think you will know why if you read it. It has that it's very different than the science fiction stuff that I've been reading. It does have a literary flavor to it. The prose, the characters, the situation has a kind of pathos or something. It's sort of a tragedy. Basically, this is all centered around something like 8 hours in the life of a matador, and it's fiction. It's sort of loosely based on the work of Manolete, Spain's greatest hero. But really, it's fiction. But what makes it unique is that Barnaby Conrad was actually a bullfighter, and he spent time with several of Spain's most famous bullfighters. Was actually on the same ticket with the most famous bullfighter in Spain, and apparently, excuse me. And so he knew something about it. He himself was almost fatally gored, and ended up becoming a writer, starting the Santa Barbara Writers Conference. And yeah, he wrote about Hemingway. And what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to read the first chapter from this, the prologue and the first chapter, to give you a flavor of, just give you a sense of what the book is like. It's a little bit gritty. It's sort of probably would be rated PG-13, so there's a little bit of AG stuff in there. And because it's Facebook and, mixed audience or whatever, I'll probably leave out a couple of words. I can tell you for sure I will mispronounce some words because there's some Spanish in here. I never took Spanish. And I apologize in advance to everyone out there who cringes when they hear me say things the wrong way. I'm not going to try to do it with any kind of accent because that would make it even worse. But it is a well-told story. And after I read the first chapter, I'm actually going to go to the back and I'm going to read, what I like about this version, this hardcover version, is there's kind of the story of how the book was written and what happened afterwards. And it's a lot of fun for writers to hear what happened with Barnaby Conrad, because he went from complete obscurity, an unknown writer, young man living, I think basically a newlywed, or they hadn't been married very long, didn't have kids, and then he writes this book when he finds out that one of the people he knew, one of the bullfighters, had been killed. And he wrote this book in response, and it just kind of took off and made his career, established him temporarily, because he doesn't seem to be well known now. So this is one day, 12 climactic hours in the life of a great man. And it's by Barnaby Conrad, and we're going to start with it's not even called a prologue, it is just text before the first chapter. I guess you might call this the opening bookend. It was a very special day, this Sunday in May, not only for Sevilla, the spiritual capital of bullfighting, but for all of the Iberian Peninsula and even for many countries in Latin America. People had come from all over Spain and Portugal and many parts of Europe, and what tickets there were left to be scalped by the revendedores were going for as high as $150. It was a very special day because Francisco Torres y Núñez, called Picote, the greatest matador of his generation and considered one of the 3 greatest bullfighters who ever lived, had been goaded into a last performance after having announced his retirement. For killing 2 Mura bulls, he would receive the unequaled sum of $30,000, 6 times the amount of the average matador. But that was not the reason he was fighting, for in his 8 years as a senior matador he had made $4 million, and he had no desire for more money. He had come from his big home in Cordoba with his entourage the day before the fight and was installed in a suite at the lavish Hotel Andalusia Palace. The hotel is 300 yards from the sluggish, tree-lined Guadalquivir River, and only a few blocks away, hugging the river, is the ancient Plaza de Toros, La Maestranza. Hours before the fight, people who could not afford a ticket had waited along the boulevard and lingered at the sidewalk cafes to watch him make this last trip to a bull ring, the beginning of the end to an amazing career. At 3:15, the first fancy carriages began to clop down the Pasco de la Delicias. Some of the women in them wore mantillas and manila shawls, and the men broad-brimmed, glossy Cordobés hats. By 3:30, the street was jammed with archaic taxis, big foreign cars belonging to falangistas, carriages belonging to royalty, and people, hundreds of people streaming to fill the 15,000 seats of the Maestranza. At 3:45, the big blue station wagon pulled out of the courtyard of the Hotel Andalusia Palace, the canvas cape basket strapped on its top. It forced its way down the swarming boulevard slowly but relentlessly, actually pushing people aside with its front fenders as it did its best to deliver its owner to the place he least wanted to go in the world. An old woman in rags spotted the gaudily uniformed man sitting slumped in the back seat next to his manager, and rapping on the window of the car, she called fervently, "God protect you, boy! God protect you!" He stared back at her with unseeing eyes as the car moved on, and his fingers unconsciously went to the scar that notched the left side of his chin. At 29, his face was sad and drawn and old, yet at the same time it was compelling and majestic. If he were to walk into any cafe in any part of the world, people would immediately ask, "Who is this young man?" For he had the look and aura of number one. Hod carrier, dancer, artist, banker, one might not know, only that he was the best in his field. The hundreds of other Sevillinos didn't have to wait to see the familiar profile. Who else in Spain had such a car? Besides its external splendor, it was built especially for a bed to be made in the back so that the Matador could snatch some sleep while traveling across the country between fights. In his best years, he had fought every other day for the entire 6-month season, sometimes twice on the same day in different towns, and there was little time for rest. At the sight of its blue magnificence wedging through the humanity, men standing at the bar in the bodegas along the river said, "Here he comes," and hurried to gulp down their coffees or pay up for their food. The bullfight is the only thing in Spain which begins on time. One little man in a beret and dungarees put down his chata of beer and stood up on his toes to look over the crowd in front. "Vaya, vaya," he murmured. "What a car! How would you like to have a coach like that?" His companion, a little drunk, clapped him on the shoulder. "And how would you like to have got it the way he did, eh, old one? Did you see his face? He looked different. How would you look if you were going where he's going?" "No, he looked strange. I talked to him only a few hours ago. I talked to him at noon, and he didn't look like that. You don't believe me? It was before you arrived. Ask the barman. I talked to Bacotti, and he talked to me just like anybody, just like you or me. We had a cognac together and a crayfish. But he didn't look like that. Ask the barman if you don't believe I talked to him. Oh, yeah, barman, come over here and—" "We'd better get going," the other said, "or we'll find someone in our seats." The big station wagon had already turned off the boulevard at the corner of the monumental stone coliseum that was the Maestranza, and it fought its way back through the bulging narrow street that led to the back of the arena. Unlike most plazas de toros, the back of the Maestranza melts into clusters of houses and bodegas that, over the centuries, have mushroomed in the damp shade under the stands, around the patio de caballos, and up against the base of the structure. People were hanging out of windows and flowered balconies around the little cobbled square, and they cheered when the car pulled up in front of the entrance. The driver sprang out and hurried around to open the rear door. The thin, broad-shouldered man in the glistening gold and white suit of lights emerged slowly, almost painfully, and the shouts became louder. "Ole, tu madre!" called a man from the balcony of one of the houses built up against the plaza. This would be all he'd see of the show, for the cheapest ticket would have cost him the equivalent of his family's food for a month. But he would hear the tormenting sounds from the arena excitement all afternoon, and he would imagine what was happening and curse his poverty. But now he made the most of this one moment. He brandished his hand in front of him for emphasis and shouted, "Ole, Don Paco! Ole, Gran Maestro!" The gaunt figure stood by the car uncertainly for a few moments, his melancholy eyes blinking at the people massed around him, his face greenish-white under the black, knobbed hat. The little bald fat man bustled out of the car, and he and another bullfighter elbowed through the crowd to convey the Matador up to the big gate. He winced under the masculine pats on his back and shoulders, and when a woman tried to kiss his hand, he jerked it away. The small door cut out and the big gate creaked open, and the men stepped in. The Matador tripped on the sill, but the fat man caught him, and the door was slammed. Inside the courtyard were the photographers, 10 of them, and the men from the No-Do, the official newsreel, who started grinding their old-fashioned camera. "There's nothing to photograph yet," the little fat man growled. "Save your film." The photographers snapped pictures as the Matador walked toward the gate that led to the Patio de Caballos. But then, as they passed the latrine, a roofless, doorless cement structure, the Matador hesitated, turned, and went in. A photographer started to follow, but the little fat man batted the camera out of his hands and blocked the doorway. "Can't you even leave the man alone for this?" he said, his bald head as red with anger as his face. "A man can't even go here without photographs." The photographer retrieved his camera from the ground, looked to see that the lens wasn't broken, and said, abusedly, "Pepe, you know me, Santana from the ABC. I wasn't going in there to take any pictures." Another photographer in back said out of the corner of his mouth, "The gentle bald Pepe is acting very strange today." "Not as strange as Pacote," said the man next to him. "I don't know what's going wrong, but something is. I hope I've got enough film. I think we're going to need it today." Pacote Torres stood before the trough inside the latrine. He was swaying slightly. What a day this had been, and what a day it was going to be. It hadn't started so bad. It hadn't started so much worse than any of the others. Chapter 1. The first sound he heard that day, the day that was to be the most terrible and most glorious of his life, was a shotgun going off. It woke him up with its pumph, then a pause and pumph again. Probably missed it, Pacote thought sleepily, with that long pause between shots. He wished he had nothing more on his mind today than going out to the tiro de pichon. Not that he liked killing the pigeons. As a matter of fact, he hated it. The Duke of Pinermoso had taken him out once and insisted that he try it. Pacote was a rotten shot, having tried it only a few times before in his life, but he couldn't miss after yelling "Pajaro," and the box trap was sprung, and the bird didn't even have time to get its wings open before pellets ripped it into a puff of feathers. He'd put down the gun and didn't shoot again, and they'd all laughed at the great killer, the fearless Pacote. But still, killing pigeons would be nice today, instead. Anything would be nice, instead. A ride around the hills in back of his ranch in Cordoba would be the pleasantest of all. He was a rotten rider, too, but it would be good, especially with someone who didn't ask him questions about bulls. Socorro, maybe. It would be nice with her. He let himself doze on this for a while, but in his state of half-awakeness, he got stuck like a cracked record on one scene. He couldn't make the bit stay in the horse's mouth. He would get it in, fix the chin strap, and then, just as he was about to get on the horse, he would find himself putting the bit in the horse's mouth again. He went on and on and on, and was so frustrating and exhausting that he made himself wake up. He flung the covers from him. Then he slowly propped his skinny frame up and sat on the edge of the ornate brass bed, his face in his hands. Now that he was fully awake, he knew his hands would be trembling when he took them from his face. Yes, it was really there inside him, as big as an ostrich egg. The fear organ was right there just below the V of his rib cage, below his heart, a great hunk of fear. It was as real as any other organ in his torso. It wasn't the dull ache of the usual fear. This was a sharp pain of fear, unlike any other he'd ever known. Well, I've a right to it, he told himself, a great big right. He reached out and absently patted the little gray dog sleeping at the end of his bed. It raised its head to acknowledge the situation, the salutation, and then dropped the mustached muzzle on its forepaws again. It had a pair of surprised and plaintive black eyebrows that always made it look as though it had just backed into a hot radiator, and it smelled of old age. "Ay, compadre, how you stink," said Pacote affectionately. To show he'd heard, the dog gave a token wag of its tail, like a slowed-down metronome, but he didn't open his eyes. Pacote looked at his watch, then the watch his mother had given him the day of La Alternativa, the watch that had been engraved on the back, "My son, do not worry, do not be afraid." It was past 11. Slept 10 hours and still exhausted. They'll be here soon. It would be better, in a way, when they got here. It was always bad in the morning, because that was when you were you. Later it was better because you became somebody else and something else. Then, for a moment, he had a great idea, an idea that made him warm inside and dulled the fear pain. get dressed in a hurry, take the Buick out of the garage, drive to Cadiz, and hop the Marqués de Comillas, bound for South America. It was nice to think about for a few minutes, a little farm in Peru and a beautiful Peruvian girl whose face was blurred but vaguely like Socorro's, only fine and decent. Then he gave a grunting, mirthless laugh at himself to make him come back to today, now, this minute, reality. "It's true," he said. "You are through. You're finished. Your nerves are shot. You need a drink." He looked across the big hotel suite at the bottle on the dresser. He'd almost killed it last night, but there was a little left. It made him sick to think of it with the hangover fuzz in his mouth, but it would feel good once it was down. God bless Los Yankees. They could make whiskey. He started to go for it. Then he said, "You fool. You've really turned into a cowardly fool. Drink on the day of a fight like this one. That's what Nino Duranda used to do, and look where it got him. You're just fool enough to drink on the day of your last fight and get a nice high colonic from a horn. If you were fool enough to get into this thing, you ought to have brains enough to do it right." He snapped the switch of the little radio on the bedside table. "This is Radio Andorra," said a reedy female voice. "Presenting for your..." He twisted the dial, and the BBC from Gibraltar had time to say, "In the 2 years which the Labour government has..." before he sped on to another station and the martial strains of La Marina di Mecopla. The music faded and a voice boomed, "Toros in Sevilla. Today everyone is..." He snapped the radio off. The door opened and a white-faced, middle-aged man came in. It was Maragatos, his cousin and peon de confianza, his #1 banderillero. He was carrying a lot of cheap paper fans and a photo and a dozen telegrams and cables. "Buenos dias, Picoro," he said, forcing heartiness. He jerked the shade and let it tug halfway up. The Andaluz sun was blinding. "Hola," Picote grunted, shading his dark eyes. "Hola, cat-killer," as Chavez picked up a third banderillero. "I don't know. I haven't seen him yet this morning. I just got up." He took the telegrams. Let's see. They were blue and not in envelopes, but just folded and pasted. He ripped through them, not reading their platitudes, but just glancing at the signature, looking for hers. There was none from her, and he threw them aside. Maragatos handed him the fans, a pen, and a telephone book to write on. Picote opened the first fan. A slip of paper clipped to it said, "Please dedicate to Juanita Perez, a great admirer." There were some pictures printed on the fan of Picote in action, and on each side was his sad-faced portrait, under which was written simply, "The Best." It was a tragic face, a strong face, an ascetic face, a face El Greco would have enjoyed painting. The prominent nose was aquiline, and the heavy-lidded eyes gave an aristocratic mien. It was a scarred face that might easily emerge as ugly in a photograph, and when analyzed in a mirror it distressed the owner. But it was not ugly. It was a fine face. He wrote on the fan in his careful, elaborate hand, the hand of one to whom writing was an unaccustomed task. "To my friend, Señorita Juanita Perez, excellent aficionada from her servant, Francisco Torres y Núñez Picote." Now what the devil would she do with his precious signature? Ordinarily he hated this business, but now it was diverting. It took his mind off today. "Here's another," said Maragatos. To an unknown person named Luis Morales he wrote on the photo, forming the words with his lips as he wrote, "To my good friend and companion." Maybe Morales ran a bar here in Sevilla, and he would hang up the picture there and tell his customers he was an intimate friend of the #1. Maybe the picture would be worth money if he were killed today. "Last photo ever signed by him," the man would boast happily if he were killed today. He shoved the fans away. "I'll finish these later," he said in his deep Cordovan accent. He folded his hands tightly together so that Maragatos would not see them tremble. He could hear heavy breathing out in the hall, and then the door of the suite opened and his manager waddled in. Jose Pepe Chavez was little and fat, with big dark glasses and a black toupee that was always askew and generally cocked over one eye. It was treated more as a beret than a wig, and sometimes it went into his breast pocket as a kind of hairy handkerchief. He had the Sunday newspapers under one arm, dumped them on the bed, and sank into a chair. "Going to be a scorcher today," he puffed. His rough face had an unfinished look about it, as though it had been made by a series of angry punches at a chunk of red putty. But there was a gentleness in the face, a sort of rough gentleness. "Hotter than the sea." As to all Andalusies, the sea to Pepe was a variable commodity used to make any statement more emphatic. Hola, Margatos. He slid the toupee off his head and fanned himself. See what your friends in the newspapers say, Paco? I hope they develop sores on their feet and be made to carry the mail. Pacote dragged over a paper to him and began to read it, his hand propping up his chin. The front page had a picture of him and one of Tano side by side. He was a smooth, smug 20-year-old. How ugly my picture is next to that young man, Pacote thought. He began to read aloud. Sevilla and people from all over Spain will witness one of the most exciting duels since the Joselito-Belmonte rivalry 30 years ago, it said underneath Julio Salazar's byline, when the great Pacote, called the monstrous one because of his prowess and ability to charge fantastic prices— sweet little termites, aren't they? Chavez grunted. Fights what he claims is his last fight with the sensational newcomer Tano Ruiz. Upon returning from his highly successful Mexican and South American campaigns last month, Pacote, aged 29, announced that he was cutting the pigtail and retiring to his Cordoba estate to raise bulls for others to fight. However, since he has not fought on Spanish soil for some 10 months, he has decided to have the last corrida of his life in his beloved Andalusia, those SOBs. He kept reading as though this interjection were part of the text. It is also said that his decision was prompted by the fact that he wished to prove to fans of young Ruiz once for all that the old maestro is still number one by giving him a lesson in the art of tauromaquia that people will never forget. Everyone knows of the now famous incident between them at a certain Madrid restaurant, and that there is no gran amor between them, and— Mierda! Pacote exclaimed, shoving the paper away and standing up. What are they trying to do to me? I told them I was not going to do anything today, told them I was going to coast. They said they'd take it easy on me. They can't expect me to commit suicide on the last one. I wouldn't have taken the fight if I didn't think everyone knew it was just a farewell exhibition. They didn't have to build up all this hay about the rivalry. Chavez flung his toupee on the floor disgustedly. The paper at the box office is all sold anyway. People want to see your last fight just to say they saw it. And that beloved Andalusia stuff, said Pacote. I let myself get talked into this one because of the pesetas, and that's all. Neither one wanted to mention the newspaper's reference to the cafe incident, the real reason he was fighting today. That dog stinks, said Chavez. So do you, said Pacote. You should have him put away. We should have you put away. Chavez took out a cigar. I think I can get Cantinflas for a third this afternoon. There was a timid knock on the door. Adelante, snapped Pacote. Come in. A bald, shabbily dressed little man came in. Buenos dias, señores, he said. It was Cayetano Montoyo, Niño de Ronda, once called the perfect Matador. What does he want? Pacote thought. That's me in 15 years if I weren't getting out. Bald as a chamber pot, bags under the eyes like wineskins, eyes as bleary as poached eggs from liquor and maybe dope, and the once beautiful build now sagged into round-shoulderedness and a pot belly. He remembered the book by the American where Cayetano, only the author called him Pedro Romero, went off with the English lady. Wavy-haired Cayetano was 19, top man in all Spain, and as the writer had said, the best-looking boy I have ever seen. Well, he must have had just a few too many English ladies or something. At 45, he looked 60. Matador? Cayetano began humbly, looking at the floor and rubbing one hand over his shiny head. There was not even any fringe at the base. It looked as though there'd never been any hair on that head at all, and that he had eyebrows seemed surprising. I hear you're short of Benderle. I cannot say this word today. I happen not to be engaged today, and I was wondering. The classic prototype of the old bullfighter. Did he have to come around today, of all days, to illustrate what a lousy business this was? Everyone knew he happened not to be engaged for a long time. He hadn't fought as a matador for 15 years, except in small-town festivals. He had put the sticks in a few times for his son, who was a second-rate novelero, but the son's manager had thought it too big a risk to have a drinking banderillero, so his son fired him. Pacote shook his head. You heard wrong, man. We're all squared away for today. They did need another peon, and he would have liked to have helped El Pobre, but it was too dangerous. All right to have somebody like Cayetano around when you were fighting calves at a festival, but if someone made a mistake with these bulls, there'd be blood spattered all over the sand. I really need. I think if I had one fight in a good quadrilla, I might sort of, get back on my feet. He frowned earnestly, trying to give more conviction to his mumbled words. "I'm not too old to make a comeback even as a matador, you know." Pacote answered brusquely, so as to end this conversation as mercifully as possible. "No, I'm sorry, man." "I'm a good man with the sticks, Paco. You know how they used to call me." "No," said Pacote. "I'm sorry." Cayetano nodded as though he'd never really expected the job, and didn't blame Pacote for refusing. He looked around the ornate room. His bloodshot eyes studied the things on the desk as intently as though they were in a museum showcase. There was the old framed photo of Pacote's mother and father standing uncomfortably in front of a painted pastoral backdrop. On the other end of the desk was the photo of Pacote and Socorro taken at the Stork Club when they had stopped in New York for a week on the way back from Mexico. There was the wallet with all the bull brands mounted on it in gold, a present from General Franco 3 years ago for having dedicated the second bull of the La Prensa corrida to him. There was the doll, a little spangled bullfighter with a fairly accurate caricature of Pacote's sad face, and the cigarette case. He started to go. Then he saw Chavez's wig on the floor. He stooped down and picked it up. He mumbled stupidly, "And this?" "Una peluca," said Chavez with a gentle grin. "Put it on. You need it worse than me." Cayetano looked at it dully as he turned it over in his hands. Then he stood in front of the full-length mirror on the closet door. With his pudgy fingers, he put the wig on his head very solemnly. It made him look funny, but it took 20 years off him. A silence came over the room as he stared, transfixed at his reflection. He was unconscious of the people in the room. He squared his shoulders and sucked in his stomach. He raised his head to make his double chin disappear. His eyes narrowed and his mouth eased into the arrogant sneer that a matador affects when going out to meet the bull. His right arm came forward slightly as though holding a muleta and a sword. It wasn't hard to imagine him striding out into the arena in Madrid the day of his presentation, handsome and lithe, and with 30,000 people screaming how they loved him. He looked at one profile, and then the other. He was lost in another generation for a few minutes. Then, reluctantly, he took the wig off and put it on the dresser. The sag came back in his body, the stoop in his shoulders, and without saying anything, he shuffled out the door. The men remained uncomfortably silent. Then Pacote sighed and said, "Ay," between clenched teeth, and went to the telephone. "Oiga, conserje," he said. "Niño de Ronda will be just going through the lobby. Tell him I was wrong. We do need a man today. Have him be at the plaza at 10 minutes to 4, and sober." He hung up and avoided looking at Chavez. "You're a fool," said Chavez, as though stating a long-accepted fact. All right, so those are the first 18 pages of Matador by Barnaby Conrad. Now I want to read to you, I think this is quite entertaining, actually. I'm not going to read the whole thing because the story is about how he gets news of the other bullfighter's death, and he goes and writes this book over a period of, I don't know, a few months, starting at 5 in the morning. He just, like, the story just spills out of him, basically, and he had published one novel that had been really tanked by reviewers, had been pretty badly received. So this is his second novel, and he sends it off, and here's what we'll start after he sends it off. So he says, "In those lean days in San Francisco, I was teaching creative writing to adults at night to pay the rent. When I finally wrote the last chapter of the novel, my movie on the wall failed me. I found it impossible to tie off the final scene after the manager Chavez lurches out of the infirmary into the Sevilla night. The book needed a few more sentences, a final image. But what? I decided to read the chapter aloud to my class, and afterwards I asked for suggestions. God bless whoever that unknown person was who blurted out of the blue, maybe he could encounter a legless beggar. Totally incongruous, totally right for Chavez, himself now truncated. I used it. The end. A Day of Fear, the working title of this book, was now finished, about 70,000 words, not too long, not too short. It was tightly written, the only novel I knew of that took place in such a small time frame, all the action occurring between morning and evening. I didn't know whether it was good or bad, but I knew as I mailed the manuscript plus a dozen sketches to Bennett Cerf at Random House that it was far better than my first novel, which he'd published 2 years before. My wife thought it was great, as wives often do. Maybe we'd have some money by the time our first child arrived, some real money. Our dreams were shattered in a few days when a wire came. Quote, very sorry, Bennett and I not enthusiastic enough about Day of Fear to publish. Returning manuscript. Robert Lynn Scott, editor. End quote. Gloom, bewilderment, frustration, deep depression, anger. I reread the manuscript. Was it really that bad? So bad that the publisher to whom I was under contract found it unpublishable. Maybe something could be salvaged. I would make a long short story out of the last part and send it to a magazine or send it to one of those publishing houses I'd read about that paid $500 to $800 for the total rights to a paperback book. But before I could do that, my wife had mailed it off to Houghton Mifflin in Boston to the attention of Jack Leggett, a young editor we'd met in Paris on our honeymoon. A week later, a wire came from the head editor of Houghton Mifflin, Paul Brooks. Absolutely delighted with your novel Day of Fear. However, with your permission, we would like to change the title to Matador. Plan to publish soonest. $1,000 advance on its way to you. Keep in mind this is 1952, when that was a lot of money. Jubilation. The first thing I did was to buy a lot of licorice. I've always liked licorice, and to be able to walk into the elegant Bloom's Candy Emporium on Polk Street and say, a pound of that, and a pound of that, and 2 pounds of that, was a luxury beyond belief. And that night we went to Trader Vic's for dinner and then to La Boheme. A week later we were still ecstatic, and in the following months we were stunned with the miraculous wires that seemed to be never-ending. I have them framed on my wall in the order they arrived. Reader's Digest Condensed Books offers $20,000 advance for Matador. Hooray, and it's only the beginning. Signed, Paul Brooks. Book of the Month Club takes Matador. Your share, $25,000 advance. If you ain't a major writer, you'll do till one comes along. The book is to be featured on the front page of the New York Times Book Review as well as the Saturday Review. Time magazine giving it 2 pages. Charles Poor and Daily New York Times gives all-out rave. Quote, strikingly effective, one of the notable books of the season, etc. Victor Haas, Chicago Tribune, says, quote, what a story this is. It is more than a novel about the man. It is the man. Like something by Goya. Olé. Signed, Jack Leggett. Will you accept Dell Publishing's offer of $22,000 for paperback rights to Matador? Since this is the highest advance ever paid for reprint rights, your period of hesitation should be brief. Signed, Paul. Matador, now #1 bestseller in nation. We're also selling rights in England, France, Italy, Germany, Argentina, Holland, Norway, Finland, and Denmark. Isn't this a lovely business? One keeps selling the same product over and over, yet you continue to own it. Signed, Jack. And from Jose Ferrer, the actor and film producer. John Huston and my position very simple. We wish to buy and make Matador into a fine motion picture with you doing the screenplay. We'll pay any reasonable price. Can you come to Hollywood to discuss? And a final frantic bleat from Bennett Kerf. A terrible mistake was made. Never saw the manuscript. Please send us your next book. The movie rights were bought by Jack Huston, but the film was never made. The rights reverted to me after 7 years, and though optioned several times, it is yet to see the silver screen. I still dream of an honest film being made from it. Matador received head-spinningly splendid reviews from around the country and remained on the New York Times bestseller list for some 50 weeks. It ultimately went into 6 printings, 3 separate paperback versions, 28 foreign languages, and all in all sold some 3 million copies. I recite all this not solely out of vainglory, but to record what a manuscript once deemed unpublishable by experts can achieve. This tale is meant to give cheer to beginning writers who are regularly meeting with soul-destroying rejections. Do not give up. The most meaningful accolade, after all was said and done, was when the magazine's Saturday Review asked several distinguished writers what their favorite book of the year had been. And astoundingly, John Steinbeck's pick was Matador. I'd never met him, an idol since first reading The Long Valley, but I wrote him immediately a sincere letter of dazed thanks. He wrote back, Dear Conrad, I like bullfighting because to me it is a lonely, formal, anguished microcosm of what happens to every man, sometimes even in an office, strangled by the glue on envelopes. In a bull ring he survives for a while sometimes. There's a fierce, unbeaten acceptance of final defeat in the bull ring, and I love gallantry above all virtues. He added that he and his wife were going to the Virgin Islands for a couple of weeks to relax, and would I care to join them? Would I? Did I? And we became great friends till his death. Such are the unexpected rewards of having written a successful novel in America. So that was Matador by Barnaby Conrad. Next week I'm going to be. We don't have any more scheduled, so I've pulled one out. We'll figure out how many more of these I'm going to keep doing. But next week I'm planning to read from a book by Clifford D. Simak called City, which I believe was a Hugo winner. It's a sort of a collection of short stories set in the far future, recounting the legends of the myths of these strange creatures that are said to have existed on planet Earth, called mankind. It's written supposedly by dogs, and that probably doesn't do anything near justice to the thing I'm going to read next week, which I think is quite brilliant. So I hope you enjoyed this tonight, and I will look forward to seeing you again, so to speak, next week. Have a good night, everybody.